What's up guys, Chase here at Rocky Mountain ATV, and today I'm going to give you my top 5 tips on how to make your suspension perform best. Alright guys, suspension on a motorcycle. It can seem difficult, even intimidating, but you need to make sure your suspension is set up and working as well as possible. That's going to make sure, one, you're safer when you're out riding, and also having a suspension that's working correctly, it's going to make your motorcycle a whole lot more fun to go out and ride. So I've got 5 simple tips I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to talk about, that are going to make sure your suspension is always working as best as possible. Now the first tip that I have is just going to be maintenance. You got to make sure you're servicing and maintaining your shocks and your forks for your suspension to always be working its best. Now a big thing is going to be your rear linkage. Now below your shock, you're going to have your linkage, you have bearings in there. You want to make sure you're cleaning and greasing your bearings or your linkage as much as possible. So you want to check your owner's manual. That's going to tell you how often you should be servicing your rear linkage. Because remember, over time, those seals, those bearings, they're going to wear out, so dirt and grime's going to get in there. And you might not notice it because it's going to come on gradually, but over time, it's just not going to work as well as it should. Now the second thing to go along with that is how often do you change out the oil in your forks and your shock. You got to remember the fork oil and your shock oil, that gets really hot when you're out riding, your suspension's working really hard. And the oil is going to heat up, and as it heats up, it will break down over time. So you want to check your owner's manual. You want to make sure you're servicing your fork oil and your shock oil as often as you are needed to prevent it from breaking down, and again, to keep everything working as good as possible. Now the last tip when it comes to maintenance is you want to make sure, now depending on the forks you have, you want to make sure you're bleeding your forks. So if you have a spring fork, you got to remember when you're out riding, air pressure is going to build up inside your forks. You want to bleed that air pressure out, because what's going to happen is the more air pressure you get, the stiffer your forks are going to feel. So you want to bleed your forks. Your owner's manual will show you how to do that. Most often, you're going to have an extra screw on your fork cap, so you would unscrew that. That's going to allow the air to bleed out. A really cool tool that I like is from Motion Pro for fork bleeders. So they just replace the screw that goes in your fork cap. So rather than having to unscrew it all the way out to bleed them, you can just press on the top of it and it's going to do the same thing for you. Now obviously if your motorcycle has air forks, well, you're not going to bleed air out of your forks. Instead, what you want to do is you want to regularly check the air pressure in your forks, because just like with a spring fork, as you're riding, you're still going to increase air in your fork. So you want to check your air pressure after every ride, before you go out riding, to make sure it's where it needs to be. Okay, so now that you've got your maintenance taken care of, my second tip is going to be setting your sag. When it comes to setting up the bike and making sure it's balanced, setting your sag is the most crucial thing you're going to do. Now, if you're not familiar with what sag is or what it means, well, you're going to hear a few different terms. You've got rider and race sag, which is how much the bike squats in the rear when the rider is sitting on the motorcycle, and your static sag, which is how much it squats in the rear when there's nobody on the bike. So you want to make sure this is set correctly. If you're not sure where your sag should be, check your owner's manual. They're going to give you a window of where it should be at. If you're not familiar how to set your sag, well, watch our how-to video. We show you step-by-step how to do it. And another key thing is setting your sag is going to let you know if you're going to need a softer or maybe a stiffer spring. And you got to keep in mind, guys, that everyone is a different shape, different size, and you need to set the sag to that person's weight no matter what motorcycle you're on. So that is my second tip, is setting your sag. Okay, so now that you've got your sag set, my third tip is going to be with your clickers. I'm talking about clickers on your forks and also your shock. Now you're going to have compression and rebound clickers on the shock and the fork. Now you want to make sure you check your owner's manual, because this is very important. Depending on the bike you have and the forks you have, your compression and rebound clickers, you could have both on the top, you could have rebound in the bottom. You just want to make sure you're checking so you know which one is going to do which. And then on your shock, your rebound clicker is going to be at the bottom, and then your compression is going to be at the top. And on some of your newer bikes, you're going to have a low and a high speed compression. Your low speed compression is going to be your clicker that you have at the top of the shock, and then the high speed is going to be the hex nut that you have there. So you don't want to confuse those two. So make sure, again, check your owner's manual. They're going to give you all the info that you need to know. Now when it comes to your clickers, a really important thing is you want to make sure you have what we like to call a ground zero, or a base setting. If you get a used motorcycle and it's just all over the place and it just doesn't feel good, well, you want to check the manual. If you don't have the manual, you can get with the manufacturer. You want to find out what the bike came stock. Okay, that's gonna be very important. That way, when you go out and you adjust your clickers and you're messing with your suspension, you always know what you need to go back to if you don't like the direction that you're headed. Now, a tip or something that we like to do a lot of times is just take a Sharpie and write on your motorcycle somewhere, or you can write on a piece of paper and then tape it somewhere, is write down what your stock suspension settings are for your clickers. That way, no matter where you go, no matter what you're doing, if you don't like how the bike is handling or performing, you can just go back to your stock settings and you can try again from there. So make sure, have your base setting, get to ground zero. So now you have your base or your ground zero, well, don't be afraid to go out and tune your suspension. You know, don't be afraid to make adjustments to get the bike to handle the way you want it to and to make it more comfortable to ride. I will caution you though, when it comes to rebound on both your forks and your shock, my best advice is I wouldn't go too far from your stock setting. Rebound's a tricky subject. You can get in a little bit of trouble there. So I wouldn't go maybe 2 to 4 clicks maximum away from your stock setting. But that's why you have that ground zero. So if you do go in the direction you don't like it, just go right back to where your manual says you should be. Now when it comes to compression, you can go all out. I like to say go big or go home. Compression is gonna make it either softer or stiffer in the front and also the rear. Now when it comes to your clickers, again, you're gonna have them on your forks, check your manual, it's gonna tell you where they're at. But I would say if you feel like your forks are too soft and you want them to be stiffer, I would say go 4 clicks in, so clockwise 4 clicks. A lot of guys will just do 1 click at a time, but you really can't notice much of a difference. So I say go 4 clicks in, that's gonna make sure you're gonna feel the difference. Now once you've done that, if at that point they feel too stiff, well now you can back it out 1 click at a time and fine tune it to get it right where you want it. If you go 4 clicks in, it's still not stiff enough, but it does feel better, well then you can go a couple clicks stiffer and get it to where you want it. And the same goes for the rear of the bike as well. So for compression, go big or go home. 2 to 4 clicks at a time minimum, and then fine tune it from there. The last thing I want to talk about with your clickers is if you buy a used motorcycle, and let's say he's had suspension done on the bike, well, the stock factory settings for your suspension probably aren't going to be relevant at that point. Every new suspension after it's been revalved is going to have different settings. So you'd want to ask the owner what his baseline or what his ground zero was, but if he doesn't know, then you probably want to get with the company that did the suspension and you would ask them, and hopefully they're going to be able to tell you what that is. Because if they don't know and you're not sure, well, you're never really going to know what to do with the suspension, you're not going to know what that ground zero is going to be, and it's going to be a lot harder to fine tune it and get it right where you want it to be. Okay, so my 4th tip is gonna be for fork alignment and torque. Now when it comes to fork alignment, there's 2 things we need to talk about. In your upper triple clamps, your forks can twist pretty easily, especially if you have a crash. So you always wanna make sure you're checking that. So you can eyeball it. If you have a crash and you wanna look at your front tire and your front fender, if they're not lined up, well, that means you need to straighten out your forks and your clamps. Now you can eyeball it when you straighten it out, but a nice tool to use if you wanna make sure you're exact, is this Fork True from Motion Pro. It's a fork alignment tool. It's really easy to use. Once you get your forks where you feel like they need to be, you can just use this just to double check and make sure they are straight in your clamps. So you want to make sure forks got to be straight in your triple clamps. After that, you want to make sure that your lower forks are perfectly straight on your front axle. Now, when you're installing your front axle and you're installing your front wheel, first thing I'm going to tell you, don't bang on the outside or the inside, whether you're taking it on or off. That can mushroom the outside, and that can prevent your forks from lining up on the axle just right. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to bang. Now, when it comes to installing your front wheel entirely, there is a wrong way to do it, which can cause your forks to bind, and that's not going to let them work the right way. So if you're not sure how to install your front wheel, we have a how-to video. We walk you through step by step. We show you how to do it to make sure your lower forks are going to be lined up perfectly straight on your axle. Now from there, we got to talk about torque. This is another thing you want to check in your manual. With your lower and your upper triple clamps, you want to make sure you're torquing those to spec. You don't want to over tighten those. For most bikes, you're going to be around 12 to 15 foot-pounds of torque on your lower clamps, maybe a little bit more on the upper. But with these lower clamps, it's really important. You don't want to over tighten that. Your outer fork tubes, they're not as hard as most people think, and if you over tighten that, you can distort it. It's just one more thing that can cause your forks to not work correctly. So you don't want to over tighten your triple clamps, and make sure you check your owner's manual, get a nice torque wrench, and that's going to help you make sure you're always to spec with those. Now my 5th and final tip is going to be tire pressure. Another common mistake made for riders is they either have too much or too little tire pressure, and you wouldn't really think it, but that makes a huge difference in how your suspension is going to feel. Now a lot of riders that ride in really hard or rocky terrain, well oftentimes they'll put too much PSI into their tires. Now most manufacturers probably going to recommend between about 12 and 15 PSI, and that's your window, and you can adjust your PSI within that window. That's totally fine. But if you go too stiff or too much PSI, well, it's gonna make your tire deflect off of obstacles, and a lot of times riders mistake that for their suspension being too stiff. And of course, if you don't have enough tire pressure, well, you can get flats a lot easier. If you are worried about getting flats because of the terrain you ride in, well, watch our video where I break down the best alternatives to avoid getting flats altogether. That's gonna really help you out there. So what you wanna do, get a good tire pressure gauge like this Tusk Pro caliper, check your tire pressure often, and again, always refer to your service manual. That's gonna let you know where you should be at. And then again, you can go up or down a few PSI, but always stay within that window, and that's gonna make sure your suspension is always working well. All right, guys, so there it is. Those are my top 5 tips to help your suspension always be working as best as possible. Remember, maintenance, check your sag, your clickers, fork alignment and torque, and also tire pressure. If you guys have any thoughts, comments, or questions, well, I would love to hear them, so make sure, comment below, give us a call here at Rocky Mountain, or chat live online. We are standing by. We want to make sure we get your questions answered. We have a lot of great how-to videos when it comes to forks and shocks and also your linkage. We're going to show you how to get those things serviced. So if you do have questions, watch our how-to videos. Those are really helpful to get you started on the right track. I'm Chase at Rocky Mountain, and we'll see you on the trails.